"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the counter," the bank manager announced loudly across the crowded lobby of Riverside National, where I'd been trying to access my account for 30 minutes. "Your son has explained your situation, and we can't process these requests without proper authorization." 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I stood holding my wife Helen's death certificate and our joint account statements, documents I needed to manage her estate 6 months after losing her to cancer. Business customers in expensive suits stared with mixture of pity and embarrassment, watching what appeared to be a confused elderly man causing a scene. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," my son Peter said, approaching with that practiced tone of patient concern. "The bank staff is just trying to help you understand the procedures." Behind the counter, 3 tellers had stopped their work to observe the situation. Other customers were pulling out phones, some recording what they assumed was another elderly person having a public breakdown over simple banking procedures. "He's been struggling since Mom passed," Peter explained to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying perfectly across the marble lobby. "Memory issues, confusion about financial matters. We're trying to help him transition to supervised account management." I stayed quiet, clutching Helen's wedding ring in my pocket. They mistook my silence for weakness. But Peter didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I'd spent 40 years as a forensic accountant for the state Treasury Department, investigating financial crimes and asset theft. He didn't know that I understood every detail of his systematic plan to steal everything Helen and I had built together. And this didn't start today. It started 3 weeks after we buried Helen, when I'd foolishly trusted my grieving mind and given Peter access to our financial information. But the real warning had come last Tuesday night when Ellen called me with news that would change everything. And that was only the beginning. I should have noticed the first sign 3 weeks after Helen's funeral, when Peter started asking unusually detailed questions about our estate planning during what was supposed to be a condolence visit. But everything truly started to shift last Tuesday night when I was sitting in my dark kitchen, staring at Helen's favorite coffee cup. The house felt emptier than usual that evening as I sat alone with 41 years of memories. The silence, my constant companion since cancer, took her away. I'd been drowsing in front of the evening news when my phone rang at 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed Ellen from Riverside Investment Services, my financial advisor for the past 8 years. In all that time, Ellen had never called after business hours, never contacted me about anything urgent enough to interrupt her personal time. "Mr. Harold, I'm so sorry to call this late," Ellen whispered urgently, her voice barely audible, "but I need you to listen very carefully. Please don't tell your son about this conversation. Can you promise me that?" My stomach clenched at the desperation in her tone. "Ellen, what's wrong? Why can't I tell Peter?" "Sir, I've discovered something about your accounts that you need to see immediately. Documents have been submitted with your signatures, power of attorney paperwork, beneficiary changes, things you never authorized." The room started spinning as her words sank in. Helen and I had spent 4 decades building our retirement security through careful saving and conservative investments. Everything we'd worked for, everything I'd need to survive without her. "Someone has been systematically accessing your accounts using forged authorizations," Ellen continued. "Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp, bring every document your son has told you to sign recently, every single paper he's shown you." The line went dead, leaving me alone with a mind full of terrible possibilities and a stomach twisted into knots that would keep me awake until dawn. I should have noticed the first sign. The next morning felt ominous when Ellen showed me evidence that would activate every investigative instinct I'd developed during 4 decades in financial crimes. Her hands were shaking as she spread documents across her desk, each page documenting systematic theft that had been occurring for months. What Ellen didn't know was that I wasn't just a retired accountant. I was a former senior investigator for the state Treasury's Financial Crimes Division. I'd spent 4 decades building cases against embezzlers, tax evaders, and people who exploited vulnerable elderly victims. I'd worked on dozens of cases involving power of attorney fraud, signature forgery, and systematic theft from grieving spouses. I understood digital forensics, authentication procedures, and evidence collection better than most law enforcement professionals. But I'd retired quietly 8 years ago, choosing anonymity and suburban life with Helen. We'd been married 42 years, and she'd been the center of my world. Without her, I felt disconnected from everything, including my own expertise. Peter had seen my grief and isolation, calculated that a widowed man would be too emotionally compromised to detect systematic theft. He'd researched our visible assets, but never investigated my professional background. Helen had always been proud of my work catching criminals. She'd kept newspaper clippings of major cases I'd solved, framed commendations from grateful victims whose stolen assets I'd recovered. Peter was about to learn that targeting Helen's widowed husband was the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. But the real shock came later that night when I realized how extensively he'd been planning to destroy everything she and I had built together. That morning felt even heavier when Ellen showed me evidence that Peter had been systematically stealing from our accounts while researching procedures for gaining complete legal control over everything Helen and I had accumulated during 42 years of marriage. Someone has been moving money from your retirement accounts, your joint savings, and Helen's life insurance payout, Ellen explained, spreading documents across her desk. They've transferred over $130,000 to shell companies over the past 5 months. But the theft was only part of Peter's plan. Ellen had discovered that whoever was accessing my accounts had also researched power of attorney procedures, competency evaluations, and guardianship filings. They've downloaded forms for having elderly relatives declared mentally incompetent, Ellen continued. They've also inquired about selling your house while acting as legal guardian. Peter intended to steal our liquid assets first, then gain guardianship while having me declared incompetent. He'd calculated that a grieving widower wouldn't detect financial discrepancies until it was too late to prevent legal proceedings. There's more, Ellen said, pulling out additional documents. They've researched the procedure for changing life insurance beneficiaries and accessing Helen's jewelry from your safety deposit box. The scope of betrayal was breathtaking. Peter had been planning to steal everything. Our retirement savings, Helen's life insurance money, our house, even her wedding jewelry that I'd planned to save for our granddaughter. But Peter had chosen the wrong target for his guardianship fraud. He'd assumed that a grief-stricken elderly man would be too emotionally compromised to recognize systematic financial crime. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But Peter made his critical mistake when he attempted to forge my signature on power of attorney documents while simultaneously transferring $45,000 from Helen's life insurance account. The signature inconsistencies triggered automatic fraud alerts at both my bank and the insurance company. The forged POA documents were submitted to 3 different institutions yesterday, Ellen explained, showing me copies of the fraudulent paperwork. But the signature analysis showed multiple inconsistencies that immediately flagged them as forgeries. Peter had practiced my handwriting carefully, but he'd missed subtle characteristics that forensic document examiners would immediately recognize. As a former criminal investigator, I could see the obvious flaws that made these documents legally worthless. There's something else, Ellen continued. The person who submitted these documents also tried to schedule a competency evaluation with a doctor who specializes in emergency guardianship cases. The timeline was becoming clear. Peter had planned to have me declared mentally incompetent within days, using forged power of attorney documents to gain immediate control over our assets, while competency proceedings moved through the courts. We also found correspondence between someone using your personal information and an attorney who advertises expedited guardianship services for difficult elderly family members, Ellen added. The level of premeditation was staggering. Peter had spent months researching every aspect of elder financial exploitation, creating a systematic plan to steal everything Helen and I had worked for while ensuring I couldn't legally defend myself. But Peter had left a digital trail that any competent investigator could follow directly to his doorstep. His technical background had given him skills to access my accounts, but he'd forgotten that financial institutions maintain comprehensive audit logs. That mistake cost him everything. And I knew the trap was closing around Peter when Ellen introduced me to Detective Sarah from the Financial Crimes Division and Attorney Michael from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation had expanded rapidly once multiple institutions reported coordinated fraud attempts. Mr. Harold, we've discovered that your son has created an elaborate infrastructure for stealing your entire estate, Detective Sarah explained. Shell companies, fake investment firms, forged legal documents, and correspondence with attorneys who specialize in questionable guardianship proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming. Peter had established 3 different fake companies to receive stolen funds: Heritage Financial Solutions, Estate Management Services, and Golden Years Investment Group. All used variations of our family information and forged business licenses. We've also found that Peter has been researching specific nursing homes that specialize in housing patients with court-ordered guardianships, Attorney Michael added. He's been planning to have you committed to institutional care over 200 miles away from anyone who might advocate for you. Ellen spread additional documents across her desk: screenshots of Peter's internet searches, copies of guardianship forms he'd downloaded, research into elder care facilities, and asset liquidation procedures. His plan was systematic, Detective Sarah noted. Steal liquid assets immediately, forge power of attorney documents, schedule emergency competency evaluations, gain guardianship, sell your house and liquidate all remaining assets, then place you in institutional care where you'd never be able to expose his crime. But what Peter didn't understand was that he'd targeted someone with intimate knowledge of exactly these types of criminal schemes. I'd investigated similar cases for decades, understood every technique he was using, recognized every pattern in his criminal behavior. The trap was almost ready. That evening felt surreal when Peter called to check on my emotional state, his voice carrying the same concerned affection he'd used for months while systematically planning to steal everything Helen and I had built during our marriage. "Hey, Dad, I've been worried about you since the bank incident today. Are you feeling confused about financial matters? Maybe I should come over and help you review your accounts." I could hear the calculation behind his concerned tone. Peter was probably monitoring news reports about financial crime arrests, wondering if his elaborate fraud scheme had been detected by law enforcement. "Actually, Peter, I had some very interesting conversations today," I replied calmly, "with my financial advisor, with some investigators, with an attorney from the state attorney general's office." There was a long pause before he responded, and I could practically hear his mental gears spinning as he tried to assess whether his months of criminal planning had been completely exposed. "Dad, that sounds serious. What kind of investigators?" "The kind who specialize in power of attorney fraud, signature forgery, and elder financial exploitation. They seemed very interested in Heritage Financial Solutions, Estate Management Services, and Golden Years Investment Group." Peter's breathing had become rapid and shallow. He was realizing that every aspect of his systematic theft had been uncovered by investigators who understood financial crimes far better than he did. "Dad, I think there might be some misunderstanding about what's happening," Peter said desperately. "Maybe I should come over so we can discuss this properly." But his voice was shaking now. Peter understood that his criminal enterprise was collapsing, that law enforcement agencies were probably preparing arrest warrants while we spoke. He was losing control. That night, the calm before Peter's destruction felt heavy with grief for Helen and rage at his betrayal of everything she'd represented in our family. I sat in our bedroom, holding her wedding ring and reviewing the comprehensive evidence file the investigators had assembled. The investigation had revealed that Peter's theft was even more extensive than initially discovered. Over 6 months, he'd stolen $167,000 from our accounts while building sophisticated infrastructure for stealing everything we owned. "Mr. Harold," Detective Sarah had explained during our final briefing, "your son's computer contains detailed research into having you committed to a secured memory care facility in another state, far from anyone who might question your treatment or advocate for your welfare." The evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple theft. Peter had planned to destroy my life completely, steal our money, sell our house, have me declared incompetent, and warehouse me in institutional care where I'd never be able to expose his crimes or maintain Helen's memory. I thought about our 42 years together, the house we'd bought as newlywed, the garden Helen had tended until cancer made her too weak to continue. Peter had been planning to steal all of it, sell it to strangers, erase every trace of the life we'd built. Tomorrow morning, federal and state agents would arrest Peter on charges that would send him to prison for decades. Jennifer would discover that her husband was a criminal who'd been planning to destroy his own father for money. But I wanted Peter to understand exactly who he'd chosen to victimize, exactly what he'd planned to destroy before his arrest ended any possibility of family reconciliation forever. Tomorrow, everything would change. But the confrontation came quietly when I invited Peter to breakfast at our house, ostensibly to discuss signing the power of attorney documents he had been pushing me to execute. His eagerness was obvious as he approached our front door, probably calculating how quickly he could complete his theft. "Dad, I'm so glad you're finally ready to be practical about your situation," he began, settling into Helen's favorite chair at our kitchen table. "I've brought all the paperwork. We can get everything signed and notarized this morning." I looked at him calmly across the table, where Helen and I had shared breakfast for 42 years. "Peter, before we sign anything, there are some things you need to understand about what you've been doing." "What do you mean?" "I know about Heritage Financial Solutions. I know about the $167,000. I know about the forged signatures and the fake competency evaluation. I know about your research into having me committed to institutional care." The silence that followed was absolute. Peter's face went completely pale as he realized the full scope of his exposure. "Dad, I can explain everything," he whispered. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect your money from poor decisions. Elderly people make financial mistakes after losing spouses. By forging power of attorney documents and planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, you've been confused since Mom died. You need help managing complex financial decisions. Peter, I spent 40 years as a senior investigator for the state Treasury's Financial Crimes Division. I've put dozens of people exactly like you in state prison for exactly these crimes." His face showed the moment he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. For months, he'd been systematically planning to defraud someone whose entire career had been devoted to catching financial criminals. "You're not just a retired accountant," he said slowly. "Senior investigator, Financial Crimes Division, 40 years building cases against people who exploit vulnerable elderly victims." He realized what I truly was, and justice came quietly the next morning when state and federal agents arrived at Peter's house to execute arrest warrants on multiple charges. Detective Sarah called to inform me that the arrest had proceeded without incident, though Peter had collapsed when he understood the prison sentence he was facing. Peter's being charged with elder abuse, wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, and operating a criminal enterprise, Detective Sarah explained. He's looking at 25 to 30 years in state and federal prison. The asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered all stolen funds, plus Peter's house, cars, and business assets. The investigation had also revealed that Peter owed gambling debts exceeding $300,000, explaining his desperate need for immediate cash. Jennifer filed for divorce within hours of the arrest, learning for the first time that her husband was a career criminal who specialized in destroying elderly people's lives. Their children would grow up knowing their father had tried to steal their grandfather's home and have him committed to institutional care. The hardest part was explaining to my granddaughter that she wouldn't see her father for 25 years, that the college fund Helen and I had established for her was safe, only because we'd caught Peter before he could steal it. 6 months later, I sold the house Peter had tried to steal and moved to a smaller place near Helen's grave. The garden she'd loved was too painful to maintain alone, and every room held memories of our life together that Peter had been planning to erase. Sometimes I sit by Helen's headstone and tell her about how I caught him, how I protected everything we'd built together. I think she would be proud that I used the skills she'd always admired to preserve our legacy. Jennifer brings the children to visit occasionally. They're too young to understand why their father is gone, but they're old enough to know that Grandpa Harold caught a bad man who was trying to hurt families like theirs. The federal charges ensured that Peter would spend most of his remaining life in environments where his manipulation skills would prove entirely ineffective. Other elderly victims would be protected from his predatory behavior. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply allowing justice to follow its mathematical progression. Peter had calculated that a grieving widower would be easy prey for sophisticated financial fraud. He'd learned too late that respect for elders isn't just moral principle. It's practical protection against those who mistake love and grief for exploitable weakness. But justice stays silent, patient, and inevitable as Helen's memory.